Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to our friends on the West Coast. My name is Louise Vetter. I'm the CEO of the Huntington's Disease Society of America, and I am thrilled to bring you this installment of HDSA's research webinar series. We are deviating a little from our strict science talks today, and the topic of today's conversation is the FDA and patient engagement. What's next for the HD community? And we're really excited to have today's conversation with leaders at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, specifically Dr. John White and Lori Hoy, who will be talking with us a little bit about the importance of patient engagement at the FDA and also a follow-up to the hearing that our community had with the FDA back in September. So we're really looking forward to their thoughts on the overall process and also how we as a community can continue to partner with the FDA to bring treatments and hopefully one day soon cures for Huntington's disease forward quickly. Before we go into the content today, I want to just review some of the nuts and bolts of our webinars. The webinar is an interactive forum. We have the first half of the session, about the first half hour, will be devoted to our speakers presenting, sharing their slides. But then quickly, we do want to open it up to questions. And you can submit questions at any time during the presentation using the dashboard on your screen. You can see in front of you on this slide, it shows you how to do it. Go ahead, type in your questions at any point in time. I'm going to save all the questions until the end, and then I'll facilitate the Q&A session. And we will do our very best to answer every question that's submitted. And I know that John and Lori are eager to hear from you and provide their thoughts. So just a reminder, submit your questions at any point in time. We'll handle all of them at the end. You just type in your question into the panel and make sure you hit send so that it makes its way from your computer to ours. I also want to highlight that, as always, we know that it's important for us to be archiving our webinars so that folks can access these important resources at any time. So all of our webinars are archived online at hdsa.org/researchwebinar, and this session in particular will be up in about a week. It takes us time to download and save everything to the website, but as of next week, you can share this with other members of your community. So please feel free, and we encourage you to pass this information along. I also just want to visit the fact that this is an ongoing series for the organization, and our next webinar is actually sort of an Uber webinar. It's expanded to run in complement to the HDSA convention on Saturday, June 4th from 9 a.m. to 12 noon. We have our research forum at the annual convention this year being held in Baltimore, and we hope folks will log in and be part of that video streamed simulcast. But then, as always, we'll be archiving it afterwards. We are going to be taking a summer break from our webinars in July and maybe August. We know that folks do take vacation. So there's no webinar currently scheduled in July. But if there is something new and noteworthy, we certainly will let everyone know, and we're eager to pick up this forum as we need to communicate important science to you. So as always, log on to hdsa.org, and you can sign up for our newsletter and make sure you're receiving information about sessions like this as they come up. So without further ado, I want to get to the heart of today's webinar, and that is a conversation about the FDA and patient engagement. And I wanted to share a little bit with you about the really impressive speakers that we have on the line today. First, I'd like to introduce Dr. John White. He is the Director of Professional Affairs and Stakeholder Engagement at the Center for Drugs Evaluation and Research at the U.S. FDA. In this role, Dr. White works with healthcare professionals, patients, patient advocates, and others involved in the use of medicines. His office provides them with a focal point for advocacy, enhanced two-way communication and collaboration, and assists them in navigating the FDA on issues concerning drug development, review, and safety. Prior to being at the FDA, Dr. White served as the Chief Medical Expert and Vice President of Health and Medical Education at the Discovery Channel, where he developed, designed, and delivered educational programming for both medical and lay audiences. And earlier in his career, he was with the Agency for Healthcare Research Quality, as well as the Council on Private Sector Initiatives to Improve Safety Security, and he was at the Quality of Healthcare I think I missed a comma in this, but he was also at the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. John, my apologies on slightly butchering your long resume. I think what's really important is to highlight that Dr. White is a board-certified internist, and he continues to see patients. So in addition to being an important voice for the patient community in a regulator position, he is working hand in hand with families to provide their care as well. So we're really grateful that Dr. White's available today to talk with us all. I also want to just introduce Lori Hoy. Lori is currently a health communications specialist on the professional affairs and stakeholder engagement staff within the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, which is called CDER at FDA. She works with patients, advocacy groups, and healthcare professionals to facilitate and enrich the interaction with CDER on issues of development, review, and safety of drugs. Prior to the FDA, Lori worked at the Discovery and Science channels, and she is an experienced and award-winning television news producer who has worked to produce nationally acclaimed health videos on important topics, including teenage depression and the dangers of smokers and smoking. And I just want to take a moment to really, in addition to thanking them for their time today, acknowledge their partnership. As we prepared for the hearing with the FDA back in September, both John and Lori were incredibly available and worked very closely with the team here at HDSA to make sure that families could get to that hearing and be heard. So as we turn the slide deck over to them and give them their screens, I just want to acknowledge and thank them again for their partnership. So Dr. White, Lori, I think we're turning the presentation over to your computer. You should be all set to take us through your slides.
Terrific. Well, thank you for that very kind introduction. Lori and I are delighted to spend some time with you this afternoon. And as you alluded to, it's really, trying to create a culture of engagement, both at the FDA as well as in the patient community. Too often we've all been on our own silos where we're talking at each other, but we're not talking with each other. And that's something that Lori and I and the other members of our team are really dedicated to changing. But at the same time, we recognize that that can be challenging. And the next slide is really designed, it's an organizational chart, and I know folks can't read it clearly, but the reason why I pointed out is it just shows the breadth and the depth of the Food and Drug Administration, which regulates 25 cents of every dollar of the economy. It's a big place, and it can be challenging to figure out who do you talk to, and that's part of the problem. And then even just at CDER, the Center for Drugs, when you think there's 17 different divisions, there's these things called super offices. There's the center director's office itself, which we're a part of. Again, it can be hard, even when you have a question or a concern. Who do you go to and who do you talk to? And that's why Dr. Woodcock created the office that I had called the Professional Affairs and Stakeholder Engagement. And a lot of times folks will ask, how is it different than communications? So communication in many ways is one-sided. You push information out to folks. You guys do that, we do that. And engagement really is designed to be two-way communication. So not only do we want to send information out, we want to pull information back in. We want to see where there's areas of agreement and when there are areas of disagreement. But more importantly, how do we plot and plan a step forward? And I think that's something that we've been trying to do with your community. And Lori certainly has been a big team player in trying to do that. Because at the end of the day, folks have come in at times and have had some great meetings with the center director and the reviews division, but historically there hasn't been that follow-up. And that's what this was designed to do, to really change the culture and change the climate. And within our office there are several teams. I'm not going to go into all the specifics because we have that on our website. But it's really designed to show that we're here for you. We want to talk about ways to engage with you, and that recognizing there are different opportunities for engagement. So you referenced our patient-focused drug development meeting, which we had a few months ago, which was really designed to hear the voice of the patient. And Lori's going to talk a little more about that. As many of you know, there's opportunities at advisory committees. There's always a patient representative. And there's opportunities for public speakers, and everyone doesn't take advantage of that. Part of the challenge is people don't know about it, or all of them are here, held in the DC area, so it can be a burden to get here, especially when you have a chronic disease, which can be limiting your ability to get around. There are these things called citizens petitions, and many of you are familiar with that, asking us to take a certain action. Whenever we put out the Federal Register notice, and Lori's great to be on the team because she never worked in government, and we recognize if you never worked in government, you might not know what a Federal Register notice is, and you're not looking for it. So in many ways, we're trying to work with the communities, the various stakeholders, including your community, to help people know about it. And I think your leadership has done a great job in getting folks aware of it. There's also external meetings. There's these things called guidances, which is our current thinking. And obviously, there's emails and still letters. People still every now and then write in to us old school on letters, and they eventually make their way to the right place. But part of that involves often people will write to the commissioner or they'll write to the member of Congress. And what we're trying to do is to let folks know that they can reach out directly to us, and we can work with them and the division to address the issues that they want concerned. But one of the things I wanted to talk about, there's a couple areas where, people can have a meeting with us, and we are limited at times by what we can say and what we can do. And we often don't explain those limitations, so people often will get unhappy and feel that we're not listening to them. And, we do have a desire to be transparent. But sometimes under the law, we can't, because there are strict confidentiality rules with criminal implications on interacting with sponsors and revealing information that could be commercially sensitive, especially impacting the stock market. So we really try to be consistent in our approaches and avoid showing bias to one company over the other, and we have to focus on the scientific facts. But the key is we want to incorporate and dialogue broadly with patients and industry, and not, again, this siloed type of approach. And really where we want to move in terms of patient engagement is, patient engagement 2.0. And how do we improve the science of patient engagement? And historically, it kind of was almost like a mob mentality, and I don't mean that in a negative way, with the HIV community, and then it moved more towards kind of this patient tokenism, and I'm not trying to be critical of it, but at that time it was, one patient. We put a patient on an advisory committee, and that represents all patients. And then it has kind of evolved more into let's have a group of patients come and talk to us, and we really next need to move to that science of patient engagement. How do we systematically understand what is clinically meaningful to patients, and how do we talk to patients recognizing that they have different perspectives of risk and benefits based on where they are in their disease state, and how do we do that within the construct of our regulatory mission and requirements. So there are times when under statute we are prohibited from doing something, even if we agree with you. And there's often misconceptions. We don't control drug price. We don't do clinical studies. So folks sometimes don't recognize that. The other aspect in terms of clinical trials and science is, most of the time, and I've seen this in my own, research background years ago, most data are not black and white. Most data are gray. And when that's the case, it's subject to interpretation. So we might have difference of opinion, especially in terms of what's clinically relevant. So something can even be statistically significant, but there might be some interpretation as to whether or not this really matters clinically. And that's why it's so important to include patient inputs. I'm going to steal one of Lori's lines that she's going to use later that, Dr. Woodcock often talks about patients are experts in their own disease. And that's what we need to recognize. There is no way that we can understand everything about a disease state. And it's not just about activities of daily living or how you're thinking, but you could take, conditions, such as the muscular dystrophies, where, historically it's been a 6-minute walk test. And we have heard from patients and patient groups that might say, well, what really matters? Upper strength mobility, because then I can feed myself, I can change myself. And that's something that is objective, it is reliable, it can be measured, it is reproducible, and that's where we really need to move in the science of patient engagement as well as the interpretation of data. There can be differences on the practicality of doing certain things. There can be conflicts with laws or regulations that create legal risk, and that can be challenging for people to understand that, again, we're prohibited by revealing certain information or even why a drug wasn't approved. We are by law not allowed to release the letter as to why a drug wasn't approved. One has to go back to the manufacturer. And then sometimes it's the evolution of underlying data, that the science isn't there yet in terms of where we are. But the key is we have to listen to people, because again, it really is the patients, all of you, that are at the heart of what we do, and we can't lose sight of that. And that's partly why this office was created, to help remind our colleagues that it's about patients. And I have the great fortune of being the director of the group, but there's lots of different players. And just a side point, it shows the commitment of the center. In this climate of limited resources, the center director stood up a new office of professional affairs and stakeholder engagement, and has given the FTEs, the full-time equivalents, the people, to actually help manage that. And with that, I'm delighted to turn it over to my good friend and colleague, Lori Hoy, who's going to talk a little more specific about the issues impacting the HD community.
Thank you, John. Well, one of the things we like to do here is sort of bust some myths. John and I both came from Discovery Channel, and we were like the whole Mythbusters. And one of the misconceptions is that the FDA is sort of the big bad wolf who just wants to say no to drug approvals. And the fact is, we don't want to say no, we want to say yes, but we are required by law to make sure that they are safe and effective treatments, and that the benefit of any drug outweighs the risk. And that is a challenge. And how do we determine that? Well, we're going to talk about that. But Dr. Woodcock, as John likes to quote, the patients are experts in their own disease, really sums it up. So we do need your expertise. And thanks to your leadership, we've gotten it. Prior to the patient-focused drug development meeting last September, HDSA conducted a survey about the symptoms and treatments, and asked our review division to comment on just what sort of questions would be most helpful to them. The results of that survey were distributed at the meeting, and it was an enormous effort by all of you. We really want to thank you for your contribution, because it was indeed a really valuable contribution. So we value our partnerships with organizations like HDSA, and you're pretty fortunate to have advocacy leaders that you do, because they have figured out how to develop a relationship with us in our office, and they are really working on behalf of all of you to make sure that we understand your issues. So the patient-focused drug development meeting, you showed up in force last September, and so did the FDA, to hear what you had to say. There were hundreds of patients, or over 100 patients, caregivers, academics, healthcare providers, industry people who participated either in person or by webcast. The neurology medical review team talked both at the meeting and afterwards in a personal meeting about how extremely moved they were by your stories. And Dr. Billy Dunn, who leads the neurology department, said that they were encouraged by your stories because it validates that drugs being currently developed are to treat the symptoms you care most about. They want to make sure that they're sort of on the right track. And, hopefully we're trying to evaluate drugs that are the drugs that you want. So if you were not able to attend in person, or if you didn't see it on the webcast, you can watch the entire meeting from this link. And if you don't want to write that down or go back into it, there's a little secret about trying to get through the rather convoluted FDA website. Just use Google, and you can Google Huntington's FDA or Huntington's FDA public meeting. It will come up. On that site, you're going to find links to the recording of the entire meeting, all the presentation materials, including those that the FDA presented about what they're working on, and a document that we call the voice of the patient. And in this report, it's in the patient's own words what mattered to them most in terms of the impacts of the disease and treatment approaches. And this summary includes not only the patient testimony at the meeting, but perspectives shared in docket comments, as well as views provided by those who joined the meeting via webcast. So it's more, if you read the report, it's more than what you'll see if you watch the video. So where do we go from here? You had your meeting. What are we going to do with that information? Well, talk to the Huntington Disease Review Team and the team leader. And he wants you to know that they are well aware of the many unmet needs for the treatment of HD, and that they work collaboratively with pharmaceutical companies who are interested in developing new treatments for patients. It's sometimes another misconception that they think we don't talk to drug companies. We do talk to them all the time. It's not like they come up with a drug, hand it to us, and say yes or no. It's really a collaborative back and forth. We have over 30,000 meetings across the center with industry throughout the year, which is another thing that tends to surprise people. So it is a misconception that we don't talk. There's a lot of money going into Huntington's research and some pretty impressive brain power out there searching for treatments. And ultimately, you know, they're all looking for a cure. The lead of the Huntington's Review Team is actually a former researcher in the Huntington Study Group, and he ran a large HD clinical center when he was in practice. He was on the board of directors of the New Jersey state chapter of HDSA, so he's very familiar with the issues. It's a team of clinical professionals who understand the seriousness of the condition, and they're committed to demonstrating flexibility in our regulatory approach to approval for rare and life-threatening diseases. They are, you know, certainly more flexible in looking at diseases such as Huntington's disease. They're going to accept a lot more risk than if you're looking at, say, a treatment for toe fungus. We also work in conjunction with agencies and academic institutions. And this is a really important thing that we're doing here. 2 weeks ago, the FDA took part in an all-day symposium. It brought together FDA, neurologists, patients, researchers, all to figure out how to get the patient voice into clinical trials, product development, and clinical care. And one of the workshops was on how to get patient preferences into risk-benefit assessments for regulatory decision-making. I can tell you that's a challenge because, as you know, it is a scientific process, and how do you turn the patient preferences on risk-benefit into a scientific process? And we spent a lot of time looking at, you know, how you can do that. How much risk one patient's willing to take for a clinical benefit. Not only varies from patient to patient, it can vary greatly in the same patient over the course of the condition. So we're all searching for answers. The good news is everybody understands the importance of the patient voice, and it was really exciting to see these Huntington patients at the table with some of the top Huntington's researchers and physicians in the country. And everybody was asking for the patient's advice, not the experts, the patients, because again, as we said, who are the experts? That would be the patients. So I want you to understand that your opinions are really very much valued. And if you want to know how to get them to us, well, I'm going to give you back to Dr. White, who has some words of wisdom on just how to do that.
Well, thank you, Lori. And I'm going to talk about what I call my 4 tips for effective engagement with Food and Drug Administration. And many of you already know this, but for those of you that don't, here are the 4 tips. And the first is know your issue. And I don't say know your issues, it's singular. And what I mean by that, and I'm talking about when people come in for meetings, and I recognize, and Lori does as well, that historically it's been very hard to get a meeting. Lots of hoops to jump through, not knowing who to engage with, and sometimes not even getting a response. But we're here to change that. And part of the challenge at times is when people come, they're just so happy to get a meeting. And it's usually an hour, and they feel like they need to go over every topic that they need to address. And there's 4 to 5 topics that they want to address, and they really can't focus that much on any individual one. And they have, 50 slides. They talk for 55 minutes, and then at the end, there's no real time for questions. So what I recommend to people, that they have one topic maybe 2 at the most, and that's what we focus the meeting on. And those have been some of the most effective meetings that I've seen over the last 2 years. The second is to tell your story. And I learned this at Discovery Channel, that there's a time and a place for data, and there's a time and a place for a story. And I recognize that since we are a technical agency and scientific agency, we're all interested in data, we don't get to hear the stories that often. And the stories really are based on the data. So it's an important reminder to us as to who are we serving and the importance of the patient voice. And behind all this data are real people and their families. And sometimes we need to be reminded of that. The third tip that I have is make an ask. And I've been surprised over the last 2 years by how many people come in and they don't actually ask for anything. And that's a missed opportunity, because if we understand what you want, then we can have a very thoughtful discussion about what our perspective is on it, what we can do, what we can't do. So for instance, when people have wanted to come in and talk about if there's a drug shortage on a trade name drug, could we force the, generic price drug, or, vice versa? And that's an easy answer, that we don't, control drug price. So if we know what you want to do and what you want, then it's a much more fruitful discussion. And in many ways, you have to start with that ask up front, and certainly prior to scheduling the meeting with us. And the fourth is follow-up. Having young children, I like to say, a crying baby gets fed. A lot of folks don't follow up, and that's partly been our fault historically, that we haven't followed up. But in many ways, you have to follow up. That doesn't mean necessarily the next day, but it does mean, what is happening as a result of the meeting. Now, something that Lori and I are doing as part of our teams are really leaving the meeting making sure that we have action items as a follow-up plan. And that's new for folks, both internally and externally, and that's something that Dr. Woodcock has wanted to do. And then we're really focused on monitoring the follow-up. So those are just some of my quick tips. I know many of you know it. I wanted to provide Lori's and mine contact information, and we're very open to receiving phone calls and very open to receiving emails that, this is a work in progress. And we really wanted to emphasize, our willingness to engage and our interest in engaging and what makes for effective engagement. So with that, I'll turn it over to any questions you might have.
Great. Thank you, Dr. White, and thank you, Lori, for that insightful review of the work that you're doing and how the community can make the most of interactions. I just want to remind everyone that you can submit questions. Just type it into the dashboard under the questions section on the right-hand side of your screen, and I'll be able to see those and can make sure that Dr. White and Lori can comment. I do have a question while we're waiting for a few more questions to come in, and it's related to the role of the FDA in drug development. And I wonder, this is a little bit rudimentary, but it's still questions that we get related to managing the expectations of the FDA. What type of timeline are most drugs on when the developing company starts talking with the FDA? How long does it really take to get a new novel treatment approved through the FDA nowadays?
Yeah, several people have done studies on this. Tufts has done this, Tufts University. It can depend on disease state, but if you're really talking about not from the time that they submit an application, but from the time that they're starting their, phase 1 or phase 2 trials, it can be a decade, if not longer. Everyone's trying to shorten that, and our role in that is how are clinical trials designed, how do we involve real-world evidence, but, I'm just being honest, it can be a decade. Part of that is, the science in terms of what we understand, whether it's lupus or Alzheimer's or Parkinson's, and how to design good clinical trials.
So I think it's also important, just from an educational perspective, to clarify that the FDA doesn't actually develop drugs, right? I mean, you're reviewing what other organizations are developing for their safety and then evaluating how accessible they should be to the community, correct?
That's a great question. So you're correct. We don't conduct clinical trials. The National Institutes of Health does. Our regulatory responsibility is to review what sponsors submit as part of what's called a new drug application. But here's what's important, and here's where there's also some criticism. So we are involved in the different phases of clinical trials, and we provide feedback to the sponsor, to the drug company. They're not required to take it. Many of them, if not most of them, do. But that's about, what are the outcomes? And what's changing and what we need to change more is, as we're talking about patient engagement, patients now are getting involved at the time of drug approval. But then it's really too late because the data has already been collected. And it's very hard to go back and collect what's clinically meaningful to patients if it hasn't already been measured as part of the clinical trial. What we need is to move much, upstream on that clinical continuum, where early on, when folks are thinking about what are the endpoints, let's involve patients then to talk about what's meaningful to them. People have criticized us that if we put out more guidances in terms of what are the outcome measures we'd like to see, that would force drug companies to measure them. But we need to have those discussions with patients because, again, it's very hard and it's very paternalistic for us to say as physicians and regulators what's important to patients as opposed to hear from them. But again, I want to emphasize, although there is a role at the time of drug approval for patients to get involved, it'd be great to have those discussions much earlier on in the process. Because at the end of the day, our requirement is to determine whether a drug is safe and effective. But we're not going to conduct the trials, and we can't force drug companies to conduct the trials either. That's been a misconception. We can't force someone to do a trial on Parkinson's or to do a trial on lupus or Alzheimer's. The sponsor has to submit the application.
It's interesting that you mentioned that industry is looking for more guidance on how to include the patients. That's something that here at HDSA we consistently advocate for, is the importance of the family perspective being included very, very early on in the development of potential clinical trials and so forth, just to make sure that that patient voice comes forward. And you mentioned the meeting at Georgetown a few weeks ago, which I was at, and there was a lot of ongoing discussion about how to involve patients early, but then also feedback from industry that they sort of need to be told to do that. I know that there have been multiple guidance documents to industry even over the last few years. Should we expect there to be more specificity to those documents in terms of guidances, or right now is it really open for industry and the patients to force the change?
Yeah, I don't think at this point in time we plan to issue any guidances, and I have gotten lots of calls, to be honest, from industry, also talking, in some way what are safe harbors where they could engage patients. But fundamentally, this is about how do you measure what is clinically meaningful to patients. And, I'm not necessarily convinced that we need to provide guidance on that in a formal manner of technically what's called our guidance process. Does that make sense? That, I'd like to see more discussions with patients, sponsors, and regulators in a collegial, professional manner as to how do we do this and how do we measure it. And there's nothing that prohibits sponsors right now from talking to patients. There isn't. People are concerned about, is this a backdoor approach to off-label promotion? We're talking about clinical endpoints in terms of drug development. And there are reasons, I understand them, why some sponsors may not want to, in their minds, include patient input early on, or there are some reservations and folks are risk averse. But these are the discussions that we should have collaboratively as opposed to just putting out, a guidance. Well, we need to hear from folks, and we need to see best practices, and we need to hear best practices. And I think your community could play an important role in that.
So we do have a few questions coming in that I want to make sure we loop back to, and I just want to acknowledge that some of the questions I've been asking reflect some of the feedback that I'm also seeing on screen. But there is a specific question related to how to resolve conflict between what patients may prioritize in terms of maybe a drug that there's a lot of hope associated with, and potentially what the FDA issues in terms of their decisions related to approving that compound. So ultimately, when there is conflict, who ultimately decides whether whether something moves forward?
I mean, ultimately, it's the agency that has the final regulatory approval as to whether a drug is approved or not. But this is the whole point of what I'm trying to talk about in engagement. And again, those discussions ideally should be held and resolved at the time of clinical trial design. So you're actually measuring them when you need to, as opposed to later on trying to kind of retrofit something, which is hard to do. But at the same time, I also recognize that when, again, we talked about uncertainty of data, data being gray, it's subject to interpretation to many degrees. And two different scientists can look at the same information and come to different conclusions when data are gray. So that's where it's utilizing those points of engagement that I talked about earlier. It's about coming into the agency to meet. It's about emailing, the leaders with their thoughts. Now, that doesn't mean that, because as I talked about, we're prohibited from talking about a specific drug while it's under review. But that doesn't mean that you can't talk about what is clinically meaningful to you, what's more important to you in terms of how a drug might impact your life. You can still talk about the broader issues. You can talk about the evaluation of risk versus benefit, for these diseases and how you evaluate risk versus benefit. So I still think there's lots of opportunities, as we've talked about, in terms of public meetings, in terms of responding to a docket, in terms of quite simply coming in and talking to us. And that can be virtual as well. I know some folks can't travel, but it can be through phone, by video conferencing. We'll make that work.
That's great to hear that commitment.
Change from the past, where it's folks didn't feel that they could comment and they didn't have a way to talk to us, and I recognize that. But we're really trying to change that, and that's going to take a little bit of a culture shift on both sides.
Now, there's several questions that are coming in that are all along the same lines. So for those who submitted the questions, I'm going to take the liberty to paraphrase because they're all similar, as I said, in content. The issue is the incentive for industry to develop treatments for diseases, and there's quite a bit of skepticism among many families that for those in industry, they'd rather have ongoing treatments rather than cures because there's more money associated with it, and issues related to sort of the commercial feasibility of developing something for a rare disease. If they're not going to make money off of a small community like HD, they may spend more time on a disease that affects more individuals, such as Alzheimer's. So I wonder, is there, or could you talk about whether or not there's a role for the FDA in helping to, I think, dispel some of these myths related to why certain diseases capture the attention of industry, and if there is something that families can look to better understand some of the business decisions that I think go into why some diseases get more therapeutic exploration than others.
That's a great question, and quite frankly, I'm not sure it's a myth. That's me talking John White, not as a FDA regulator, because industry, wants to make money, and they're looking at, what drugs are going to make them the most money. Now, some ways that the agency and government have tried to address it is, through some of these voucher programs in terms of rare diseases, pediatric diseases, as well, and issues of exclusivity of a drug, and as well as an infectious disease category. We're trying to get companies to develop drugs. But I should add, all of those incentive programs have been determined by Congress, meaning we can't decide we're going to give someone exclusivity for something that we feel they should develop unless Congress allows that. So we don't have that type of authority. But there have been incentives created by Congress. Not everyone agrees with them, to create treatments in disease categories that are often overlooked. But I think the other discussion to have that you could have with the agency is, sometimes folks will say, again, maybe the science isn't there, so that's why, maybe that's why there aren't better drugs in Alzheimer's. To some degree, people will argue that we don't quite understand the science. But then other people will say, for certain disease categories, and this is where we could have a very fruitful discussion, is that in general, pharma companies are risk averse. And if they don't see a roadmap to approval, they're not going to invest in a category that there is uncertainty of. And if the agency was more clear, perhaps through a guidance, in terms of what the important outcome measures were, that's quote-unquote a roadmap for people for drug approval. So if you do these things, you're likely to be approved. And that's what we'd want to hear from folks if they feel we're creating a barrier because there is uncertainty. And that's where we'd have that discussion, whether we agree with you or not. But in terms of the financial incentives to companies, that has to be determined by Congress.
Also along the lines of finances, I know you mentioned that the FDA doesn't set pricing, but certain
application in for generics and not plan to market it ever, or not plan to market it for a few years. I think it's more broadly, I'm just being honest, a societal question about drug pricing. Our remit is to look at data and determine whether it's safe and effective, and if it is, that's approval. But we don't have that ability to say what the price should be.
Thank you, and I am going off of community questions, and I know that as they're submitted, that they reflect the curiosity of a lot of members of our community. So I think it's really important that you're taking the time to answer some of these points, John, so thank you. I have a question related to some of the novel biomarkers that are being developed in Huntington's disease, and wonder what the current thinking is, or potentially policy from the FDA related to the collection of cerebrospinal fluid or brain imaging as different tools in clinical trials for Huntington's disease. Is that an area where your agency is weighing in?
Sure. I think we are profoundly interested in biomarkers, and that's across the agency in terms of different disease states. Every disease isn't amenable to biomarkers, but you're exactly right, and that's where we need to have those discussions with industry, with scientists, with patients. Think about the field of oncology, where it really has changed over the past 10 to 20 years, and that primarily has been with the development of biomarkers. So if we could do more work in neurodegenerative diseases in the field of biomarkers, working with folks, that would be terrific. But again, the key is, we have to have agreement on it. We have to, and that's sometimes where folks miss it. You don't want to go down the path of a biomarker if the agency is not going to accept that, as essentially a surrogate measure.
Okay.
So I definitely think it's an area we're very, very interested in, and we should have more discussions on that.
Okay. Following the hearing in September and the Voice of the Patient report, I'm really struck by the efforts to collect a lot of group thinking about Huntington's disease, something that I liked your phrase about moving away from patient tokenism to sample sizes or open activities that allow as many people as possible to weigh in and share their experiences. But I also counterbalance that with something that many HD clinicians say, which is that if you've met one HD patient, you've met one HD patient. So recognizing that if you've heard from 100 folks or 200 folks, that's still only a small subset of the overall community. What ongoing opportunities can the community have to add to the voice of the patient conversation? Are there plans for a follow-up activity, or is there a way that our organization at HDSA can continue to collect and add on to the survey information that we conducted last year?
Yeah, I think we should, have another conversation about this. So here's what I would say about this. So, the voice of the patient and the PFDD, by its very nature and design, is qualitative information that can help us see some themes and some signals, about what's important. But this goes to my point earlier in the conversation about we need to develop a science of patient engagement. And at the same time, we also don't want folks to just go out and do a survey without talking to us beforehand about, what's that survey design? How is it conducted? We do have lots of restrictions about our own ability to conduct surveys. So if the HD community is able to help exactly what you said, build upon what we're already learning. So again, that was qualitative, it was themes, it was important information. But how do we bring it to the next level of, surveying people and understanding their thoughts is and patient preferences is a social science. And there's a methodology for that. So let's talk about how to do that well. That's going to fit everyone's goals and priorities. So I definitely think there is an opportunity, and that's what's great for you to come forward and say, how can we move it to the next level? But that's probably a series of conversations to figure out how to do there. But it's great that you're thinking about it and not just going out and doing it on your own and then bringing something back to us.
And we're very great. Yeah, and we're very grateful that we've worked so closely with Lori in the surveys that we did issue, and we definitely see this as part of an ongoing conversation. And from our perspective, we want to make sure that it wasn't a one-time event, and then we sort of go back to our various camps. So thank you for the follow-up on that. Another question's come in, which actually again resonates with a lot in our community, and this is I think the perception that some really pivotal science for Huntington's disease is happening outside of the U.S. and how do we attract more of that to happen here in our country. And a perfect example is some work being done by Ionis Pharmaceuticals on gene silencing, and it's taking place in Europe and Canada. And this is a study that the HD community is following very closely with a lot of hope. So I use it as a current example, but there aren't opportunities right now in the U.S. And so, again, as an example, I think the larger question is how do we make sure that these opportunities to get involved in really novel exploration of life-changing science are happening in the U.S. As compared to other regulatory environments?
Sure, and it's a misconception that most trials are conducted in the U.S. So you may know we have this initiative called Drug Trial Snapshots, which is looking at the demographic data by sex, race, and age, but we've also been publishing some data based on what's been conducted in the U.S. versus rest of world. And there are many studies in many disease states that are conducted outside the U.S. and the rest of the world. And there is no statutory requirement that studies be conducted in the U.S. for approval. That's why companies can go elsewhere. And again, now this is John talking, that there might be a perception by many companies that it's cheaper, it's faster, it's easier to enroll patients outside the U.S., perhaps because, the IRB structure may be different. And this is a good example of we have limited authority to require that all studies have to be conducted in the U.S. We like to say we'd like to see at least one study in the U.S., but that doesn't have to be an absolute requirement as it is right now. See, but that's where I often think that's the role of patient groups as well, to raise that issue with sponsors, to raise that as a more visible topic if that's what you're concerned about. That doesn't mean that we're not concerned about it, but we have limited regulatory authority. I think you bring up some very good points, and it's not something new to us. We've heard it, in many disease states, because then if people want access to the drug, they have to go outside the U.S., and that can be very expensive, not just financially, but psychologically, put a lot of burden on families, but I'm not quite certain how to address that from a regulatory agency. I'm just being honest in terms of what we can and cannot do, and that's why I think it's so important to have these discussions, because folks might just think, well, we're being difficult. We're not. I understand what you're saying, but I'm not sure what our regulatory authority is under the current legal environment to change that.
So a follow-up question to that, because I think that's an important reality, and I appreciate your personal thoughts on that. The fact that that the agency does not require the trials to happen in the U.S. They can happen anywhere on the globe. Does the fact that the clinical data come from outside the U.S. slow the approval process if it is brought to review by the FDA? I'm curious if that has an influence on the timeline for approval if all of the studies were conducted in another country.
So, it's a great question. So here's how I would phrase it. So usually we look at our timelines, because that's the information we primarily have, is from the time that a company submits their data, at the time of the NDA, New Drug Application submission. And we are very good about what our approval times are nowadays, meeting what you may know is called PDUFA goal dates. So we have seen no difference in terms of time for a decision, whether it's approval or non-approval, based on the time that the NDA is submitted to a decision, whether the studies were conducted in the U.S. or not the U.S. Now, what companies might say, I don't know that, so I don't work for industry, so you'd have to talk to industry, is they may feel that clinical trial recruitment and enrollment is sometimes faster outside the U.S. So in their mind, they're thinking, that helps me get quicker to submission of NDA. Does that make sense? Whereas I'm giving you the timeline from NDA submission to decision. And I'm saying that does not vary based on whether trials are conducted in the U.S. or the non-U.S. But really what your community, I'm sure, cares about is that entire time frame, from when they start the trial to the time that a decision is made.
Okay.
And
yeah,
I think what some people will say, and it may or may not be true, is that from phase 1 and then ultimately clinical trial recruitment and enrollment and the conduction of the clinical trial is quicker outside the U.S. than inside the U.S. I don't know if that's true, and we don't tabulate that data. We tabulate the data from the time that you submit the NDA, because that's what we can control.
Right.
I can't control how your clinical trial recruitment, but I recognize that on many folks, they want to enroll patients as quick as they can. That's where I think, the community, as you are doing, are getting involved. You're getting involved in these societal issues and these policy issues, because there's only so much that the agency, can impact. Our issues are, what are the endpoints? What's the generation of evidence? And that's why the topic of real-world evidence has come in. Would that make it quicker? And I recognize that everyone wants drugs that they feel are safe and effective approved sooner. But that's the entire, universe of folks that are involved in it, not just regulators, but also developers, the clinical community, the patient community. And again, too often, everyone has been siloed. The regulators are over here, the patients are over here, industry is over here, the physicians are over here. And they all like to talk to their own groups. And we need to break down many of those silos and have a conversation across the different groups and try to come up with some areas of agreement and a path forward.
Well, thank you, John and Lori. We are dangerously close to 1 o'clock, and I do just want to reflect on, I think, the era of collaboration that I am seeing from my seat in terms of more effort, not only by the FDA, but also among industry and other patient organizations to come together collectively to talk about some of these challenges and more organically include the patient perspective throughout the entire drug development process. So, it's something that I personally see, and I think as a community we're more aware of. The challenge, of course, is once these conversations start, how to move them forward. And I think that's really the next hurdle for the HD community, is how to make sure that these conversations have follow-up items and have traction in a way that's really resonating. Because I know personally I would love nothing better than for Dr. Dunn and his entire team at the FDA to be overwhelmed with potential therapies for Huntington's disease that they have to review, evaluate, and make decisions about. I firmly believe that the more shots we have on goal, the quicker we'll have treatments and cures for our families. And so we want to keep you busy and give lots of reasons for the team to say yes to our families. So thank you both again for your time today. I want to remind all of our listeners that this webinar will be on the hdsa.org website in the coming week. There's plenty of time for follow-up with members of the HDSA team, but also Dr. White and Lori have provided their contact information, which I've left up on screen so that you can reach out to them directly. But again, I just want to really thank everyone for participating today and having this meaningful conversation. It means a lot to the HD community that that your team and that others at the FDA have made themselves so consistently available for this conversation, as it definitely is part of the hope we have as a network of families. So thank you.
Sure. Thanks for including us.
All right. Have a great afternoon, everyone. And for the HD community, we'll see you on the next webinar, and hopefully we'll see you at convention in a few short weeks. Thank you all.